Hi, everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with another episode of the Daly Express. Today's guest is a retired Army Special Forces officer and a former director of operations at the Institute for the Study of War. You can read his written thoughts over at the Dispatch, among other places. I'm talking about Mike Nelson. How's it going today, Mike?
Doing well. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me and thank you for your service. It's great to have you on. The two of us met briefly at the principal's first reception in DC back in February, but I'm looking forward to having a longer conversation with you today.
Yeah, it was a pretty busy room, so more time to talk today, I guess.
Loud and busy, and we had definitely definitely some loud people there. I wanted to talk to you today mostly about Iran. There have been huge developments, of course, over the past couple of weeks on the heels of a very successful bombing campaign by Israel that took out key targets in Iran. The United States last weekend dropped bunker buster bombs on three Iranian nuclear sites. The Trump administration announced pretty quickly that an extraordinary amount of damage had been caused to those facilities. And you wrote in a piece for the Dispatch that they published on Monday that the strikes would most likely lead to an end to the conflict. A few days have passed since then. A ceasefire has been declared, and though it hasn't been gone super smoothly. And there have been some conflicting reports as to the extent of the damage to those sites. I know this is a very tough question to answer at this point. The strikes were, less than a week ago, and our intelligence agencies are still busy assessing things. But where do you suspect the overall situation stands right now? Do you think this conflict could, in fact, be coming to an end, or is it already over? And if so, what does over mean?
Well, just to clarify, and I'm not trying to nitpick or parse too much, but what I was saying in the dispatch is this was the best option to bring the conflict to a conclusion, or at least this portion of it. Not necessarily that it would. There were a lot of unknowns that at publication on Monday were still the dust still hadn't settled after the strikes. So what I basically described is we were in this escalatory spiral where Israel had started strikes to try to dismantle or destroy the Iranian nuclear program. It was unable to complete the job based primarily around the fortifications or the underground nature of the Fordow facility and the lack of munitions that Israel had, or at least conventional munitions that Israel had to be able to attack that facility. And therefore, they seem to have shifted towards targets that were putting more pressure on the regime, either to coerce the regime to change behavior or to actually potentially decapitate several regime leaders, potentially try to lead to a popular uprising or something like that. So that put Iran in a position where they're thinking now regime survival is at threat, is under risk. And we have more incentive to try to sprint to a nuclear weapon breakout as a trump card to prevent anybody from trying to topple our regime. So both sides are basically escalating towards outcomes that are probably not in America's interest, at least not at this moment. A toppled or destabilized Iran, who knows what comes next and who knows who has to exert influence to help stabilize it in the aftermath, or a nuclear Iran or an Iran that is accelerating towards nuclear weapons breakout. So our attempt to at least disrupt the facility at Fordow was the most likely one that was going to bring at least a pause in that escalatory ladder. Now, what we've seen, we know that we did significant damage. We know that there were, you can't drop those 6 precision munitions. And we saw the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, describe exactly what those munitions are capable of this morning. So we know that there was some disruption. I think there is, within the parameters of the program has completely been destroyed and can never be reconstituted, and there is no need to engage with Iran any further on their nuclear program on one extreme, and we've only set it back maybe a couple of weeks. I think neither of those are likely, and the truth is somewhere in between there. We've seen the Trump administration, the president himself, the secretary this morning, trying to come out and very firmly suggest that it is closer to the right side of that spectrum that I described. The president said, I think it was this morning, or maybe I heard it this morning, but he just said there's no need for follow-on conversation about the nuclear program, right? The quote was, "We destroyed the nuclear." I don't think that's true, but I do think it is more disruptive, most likely, than that DIA that leaked. Number one, leaked. Number two, only partially and low confidence assessment that said that it was only set back a matter of months. I think it's more disruptive than that. I think it's definitely more successful than that. I don't know that it did not kill the know-how. It did not kill. We don't know if there are other facilities that maybe we didn't know about. We don't know what happened to the hundreds of pounds of already refined uranium that may have gone missing. And you saw Jennifer Griffin asked about that this morning, and Secretary Hegseth wanted to change the subject towards how much he has personal animosity towards her. So there's still a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, to quote Secretary Rumsfeld. And what's going to come of that is to be seen. But a positive outcome has come from this strike. There has been a ceasefire. Israel at least feels like they are no longer under imminent threat or threat within a matter of months. The regime doesn't seem to think that it is under immediate threat of being collapsed or decapitated, or that they need to lash out. Their response against LUD was very measured, very communicated in advance. According to the president, they asked for a key window when it was best for them to strike. So everything seems to suggest that we are at least at pause and return to what we were before the beginning of June, when Israel started their campaign against the nuclear program, and potentially, in a good place to re-engage on discussions of what is going to happen diplomatically with the Iranian nuclear program.
You mentioned that press conference where Pete Hegseth got a little testy with Jennifer Griffin. She was asking about whether highly enriched uranium may have been moved from one of the sites, at least one of the sites. Maybe it was multiple ones. I'm not sure. But beforehand, I think the Trump administration did give Iran sort of a heads up that they were going to drop these bombs. Is that like a real concern that you think? I don't know enough about enriched uranium as far as how mobile it is, how it can be moved. Do you think that's a legitimate concern that they may have had? And I get why the Trump administration would notify Iran, human casualties to minimize those. But do you think that is a legitimate concern, that they may have had time to get some of that stuff out of there?
Well, first of all, whether the administration directly told the regime that they were going to strike or not, I think that there was enough conjecture in the open source, and anyone with half awareness of the situation would be aware if the United States was going to strike, where we were going to strike. The three key facilities that have been mentioned forever and that we ended up did striking. So I think the Iranians, even without any communication from the Trump administration, would take a look at moving their equipment if they felt the strike was coming, or that they felt that was likely. So I don't think that communication from the Trump administration, whether it happened or not, I don't think is necessarily to blame for any movement. I think it is possible, not being a nuclear physicist, I'm a pure liberal artist myself, but I understand it is possible to move this uranium without, it's not like you put it in the back of your trunk and drive away, but it's not prohibitively complicated to move it. I do think it offers potentially, the Iranians, it's a bargaining chip as they talk about what we're going to do diplomatically. They have 400 pounds of 60% refined uranium. From what I understand, again, not being a nuclear physicist, that it still would require further refinement to weaponize, but could potentially, it's already further along towards that process if they have some other enrichment facility. I also think that's important. For the longest time, we did not know, we the West didn't know about the Iraq ARAK, not IRAQ, heavy water reactor for their plutonium program until the National Council for the Resistance in Iran released that in a press conference in Paris a decade or so ago. And so there's the possibility that there are other facilities surreptitiously built that we don't know about. We will never have a perfect intel picture, which kind of goes back to the assessments of what has been damaged thus far. It's a best guess based on multiple sources of intelligence, and the Iranians are never going to say, good, here you go, let's show you what you got. But so there are still some unknowns, and there's still some gambling that's going to have to be done by the administration as to what cards we think the Iranians are still holding. But I think it's likely that they move their uranium, that it is somewhere being stored in another facility, and maybe they'll show their cards in negotiations. But either way, kind of goes back to what we're talking about. The president saying we destroyed the nuclear and we never need to look at it again is probably a simplistic way of looking at where we are right now.
Another part of the story that I know you were asked about earlier this week on the Dispatch podcast is how President Trump came to the conclusion to, as the late John McCain once put it, bomb Iran. The reporting from both sides of the political media heavily suggests that Trump was not initially on board with Israel's latest offensive against Iran, but once he saw all the glowing praise that Netanyahu was receiving on Fox News for its success, Trump, I guess, grew jealous and what kind of wanted in on the action. Stephen Hayes in that podcast episode expressed concern over Trump's reported line of reasoning, basically arguing that whether you agree with this or not, this is no way to make foreign policy decisions that are this consequential. Now or down the line. Mike, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to have kind of the attitude of, and I totally get this, hey, I'll take a win like this any way we can get it. And I think both of those positions, again, I think they're both valid. But do you worry now, and it sounds like you do based on your earlier answer, that, erratic decision making like this could end up hurting America's handling of the situation going forward? Because this is very complex stuff to sort of announce an end to the nuclear, as you say. That might suggest an attitude from the administration that's not advantageous.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have as simple a view that I'll take a win. And I think the president made the right decision. I think that as any president, he deserves credit when he makes the right decision and criticism when he makes the wrong decision. Like I said, is true of all presidents. In that piece for the Dispatch, I laid out what I thought was the logical reason why the United States should have struck. And then, as I told Steve Hayes, I don't think that I would make no claim that that was the logical chain that the president followed. I don't pretend to know his thinking, or nor have I ever met the man. But the New York Times reported things that I think comport with what we've seen, that it was more about the conversation around the Israeli strikes and his desire to participate in that conversation and be a part of it and gain credit for it that changed the perspective and made the decision to launch. I also think the president seems to like either situations that are clean and discreet and limited, or that he perceives to be so. So he seems to indicate, I took care of the problem, don't need to look at it anymore, it's dealt with, we're done. When in fact, this was a bold decision, it was the right decision, it seems to have led to a positive outcome, at least in the short term, but it's part of a larger and very complicated situation that includes actors, at least three: the United States, Israel, Iran, but also the European allies, the Gulf Arab countries that are, worried about an Iranian nuke, that potentially would be aligned in a larger conflict with Israel. A lot of people are looking to the president and trying to gain game out their future decisions based on where they believe he is, where his thinking is, what he might do in the future, and trying to get on board with the United States. It's very hard to do when there doesn't seem to be a guiding principle or doctrine in what guides some of his decision making. Now, in fairness to President Trump, it's not just him who's done this to allies in the past. I was in a conversation with a representative of a foreign country when we were planning an operation in Syria, or operations in Syria. And this person harkened back to Obama's red line. He goes, just to be clear, our government expended a lot of political capital to get everybody ready to go do strikes against the chemical program. Sarkozy asked, Obama asked, Sarkozy went and leaned forward to get all the alignment, and then you guys pulled the rug out and changed your mind at the last minute that you didn't want to do strikes against the chemical program in 2012. So that, we've done that a lot. This president seems to be more mercurial than most in some of his thinking. And so much so that even some of his own allies or political allies embarrassed themselves, swearing, that this president was never going to strike Iran because it's not our business, and we're out of the business of Middle Eastern wars or anything like that. And they got caught with egg on their face when he did the right thing.
Yeah, actually, that was my next question. In regard to the U.S. domestic politics surrounding Trump's decision on Iran, I wrote a piece earlier this week titled Three Cheers for Neocon Don, in which, while praising Trump for his decision, I too think it was the right one. I pointed out that what he did was exactly what many of his high-profile supporters, not just in the media, but also in top cabinet positions in his own administration, that they had portrayed as, warmongering, World War III provoking bloodlust that voters needed Trump in power to prevent. These people had weaponized that theme against virtually every, at least Republican political rival Trump has ever had. But by these people's own framing, over the better part of the last decade, what Trump did would seem to make him the ultimate neocon. However, I'm sure you've noticed, like you said, since last Saturday, many of these same people, including Vice President J.D. Vance, without any sense of regret or shame, have now been arguing that this is different, with Trump because Trump's totally awesome and he's really smart. So I guess my question for you, Mike, is: do you think that this anti-interventionist movement, which until like a week ago had been pretty comfortable and pretty cocky, they've had this home in MAGA world, are they effectively dead now after this? Are the neocons ruling the roost again?
So I think it's always been a misconception to paint the president as an isolationist, right? Part of it is because, like we said, he doesn't necessarily have one governing school of thought. Some situations are situational, and he makes the decision in the moment. I don't know how true it is, but the reports are that his original decision to strike Syria after the first strike we did in response to their chemical weapons use was because Ivanka appealed to him on a humanitarian basis. Look at what they did to Syrian children, and he was moved by that and struck the Assad regime in response to that. In many ways, even during the first Trump administration, he was willing to do things that were at least more aggressive than Obama, and I would say in some cases potentially more aggressive than something Bush would have done. Killing Soleimani was earth-shattering. The idea that Haji Qasem might not be walking among us and pulling the strings anymore was unthinkable, and he did it. Now, I do think he likes these things that, like I said, that either are or that he perceives as short duration. And, he has, both with the Soleimani strike and with this one, these have not led to larger escalation. And they probably have reinforced his belief that he can decide when things start and stop. That may not always be the case. When we did this strike on Sunday, on Saturday night, Sunday morning, we basically ceded decision making to the Iranians. We have now made a move. It's now your turn to decide how to respond. If you're going to take the opportunity to de-escalate, if they had decided differently, we'd be in a different situation. If they had decided to escalate after Soleimani, we'd be in a different situation. But I was working in Special Operations Command Central, primarily on the Syria campaign, when President Trump came into office in 2017, and it was, highly. There were a lot of changes that they made that gave us a lot of authorities to pursue that campaign more effectively that the previous administration, Obama himself and the Obama NSC, had seen as too aggressive, too escalatory, too risky. And the Trump administration, now I credit Secretary Mattis with a lot of this, but the president deserves ultimately the credit for the decisions he makes, or that are made on his behalf. So he was more aggressive in Syria. He was more aggressive against the Iranians. The maximum pressure campaign that existed during his first administration was pretty effective at pressure on the Iranian regime. So I think the people who, for their own purposes, like Steve Bannon and J.D. Vance and some of these others, who want to say, isolationism is the name of the game now, have misread the president himself. But I think that he doesn't have the desire for these things that he sees as messy, and sometimes messy is necessary. So the Afghan war is seen as messy, the Iraq war is seen as messy, and so he has no interest in those. So I'd say that the people who are rising right now are still probably, refer to themselves as the restrainers. That we shouldn't defend Europe too much. We shouldn't defend the Gulf Arabs too much. We shouldn't fight, alongside Israel too much. Maybe Taiwan's worth it, but generally we should build industrial capacity for our very limited and realpolitik needs primarily. Less involved in transatlantic alliances, less involved in campaigns for virtue or projection of U.S. power. So I do think that we are still in a place where American presence is receding from the global stage more than it was 20 years ago, but it's not purely isolationist yet. Now, again, going back to the president's somewhat mercurial nature, if you saw his comments from NATO, I guess this morning, he's all on board NATO now. Now, it might be because they did what he said. They've agreed to 5% spending, and now he loves them. Or it could be that they were the last ones who spoke in his ear. But he seems to be, at least, he has the zealotry of a convert right now on NATO coming out of the conference.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive development, at least from my perspective. I will say, just purely anecdotally, as someone who has been called, a neocon at least 3 times a week for about the last 10 years online, that hasn't happened since the Iran strike, not once. So maybe that's something to look forward to. One of my favorite, and I know for a fact you've gotten this too, is when you express your opinion that we need to help out these other countries, whether Israel or Ukraine. You get these people who weigh in, usually, anonymous accounts, who say, well, you want to get, involved in these affairs, why don't you join the military and fight there? I thought you had a great take the other day because someone tried that with you, and you pointed out that, you have been, you fought against Iranian backed Shia militias. I mean, you've done this, but does that sort of get on your nerves, sort of the oversimplistic, attacks against any sort of support of other countries with our military, sometimes even without our military, as we've seen with Ukraine?
Well, I think that I used to joke, and this has changed a little bit since the Ukraine war. I'm a big supporter of the cause of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence and defending their borders and their citizens. But I used to joke, and it is just a joke, I'd fought in every war I've mongered. So, it's okay if I warmonger. I have not fought in the Ukraine war, but I support Ukraine defending themselves. But it is a funny response. It's an easy trump card for me to play when people say, oh yeah, why don't you serve? And I did serve for 23 years and deployed 11 times. But I also think it's a problem. There are a couple problems. The first is the idea that only people who served or are willing to serve, or the one that I really hate, send your sons and daughters, as though 18-year-old sons and daughters are property that can be sent off by their parents as opposed to making decisions on their own. The idea that only those who serve are worthy of having a voice in American foreign policy is ridiculous, right? At any given time, 2% of the population is serving in uniform, but it's a United States decision how we use our power and what we present ourselves in the world abroad, right? The United States goes to war, not just even if the fighting is done at a limited basis, but the United States decides to put its power and influence and wealth behind and reputation behind those causes, and those causes that are worthy of us and that reflect our values. I can't remember who I heard say this, but they were talking about the competition in the globally between the United States, Russia, China. They said there's no such thing as Russian or Chinese values. There are only Russian, Chinese interests. We always balance everything against our values, and that is a decision that gets made, by the people as a whole. So I absolutely push back at the idea that only people who serve or are willing to go to war ever can make a statement about what they think American power is worth. The second problem is the idea that only boots on the ground, slinging lead in foreign countries is the only kind of power or influence that America has. That's ridiculous. We have diplomatic, we have economic, we have informational power. We have all these things that we can do. Ukraine, literally zero American soldiers fighting in that conflict, but we have the ability through our information and diplomatic and economic support to them to be able to help them and empower them to continue fighting the fight. Israel has accomplished so many things over the past 2 years, or a year and a half since October 7th, that we did not necessarily ask them to do. But because of the threat that they found themselves under in the changed environment, they dismantled terror networks and disruptive networks across the region that threatened our interests and our allies. They have now dismantled a leadership structure of Iranian proxies and Iranian IRGC and Quds Force that have attacked Americans. They've sought revenge on our behalf for attacks going back to the 80s against Americans. So, and we've been able to do this without the cost of any American blood. Just recently, with Americans getting involved for the first time in this specific conflict on Saturday, and without loss, thank goodness. So, American power and influence is worthwhile. And the other thing is, we're kind of the only ones that are holding the post-Cold War order together. If we recede, people with a lot worse interests and a lot worse decision making are going to fill that vacuum. And it's not just Russia and China, it's Iran, it's Turkey, it's some of the Gulf Arab states that are going to fill that vacuum and will gladly take over the access and placement and interests and influence around the world that we would receive. Whereas not only are we the ones who do it best, it's actually in our interest. We've gotten richer, more powerful, more stable because of the post-Cold War order that we kind of stumbled into. And right now, I'm afraid, really since the end of the Bush administration, haven't been doing enough to preserve.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think even in the early 2000s, we almost everybody on the right understood how silly that sort of rhetoric was when it came almost exclusively from the left. The Michael Moore groups, the Code Pink, but it's wild now. Not just that so many people on the right have adopted it, but also adopted it in where we've been much less directly involved, as far as, like you said, puts feet on the ground. To see that happen now, but no, I think this is very insightful. What you've given here to Daly Express listeners, Mike. I want to thank you so much for coming on, and I'll definitely include your links to your columns on the Dispatch. They're always very helpful, very informative. Is there anything else you'd like people to know about you and your work before we sign off today?
I was glad to participate, and I've spent a lot of my time in the region. Still care about what happens in the CENTCOM AOR, the Central Command Area of Responsibility, and I think we're at a key point in history. Be watching and commenting as it goes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks for coming on, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.